Why does your robe keep whispering my name? The question flashed through Emily Carter's mind the instant her fingertips brushed the heavy black fabric, and she nearly let it slip from her hands into the basin of cool water. The royal laundry sat beneath the eastern wing of Blackthorn Palace, where daylight filtered through narrow stone windows and turned drifting steam into pale ribbons of silver. It was the quietest place in the kingdom, hidden far below the grand halls where nobles celebrated victories and generals debated strategy. Down here, nobody remembered the names of the servants. They remembered only whether the royal garments returned spotless. Emily preferred it that way. Invisible people survived longer. Every sunrise, she carried baskets that weighed nearly 50 pounds, scrubbed away soot, rain, and travel dust, then folded each piece with perfect corners before the evening bells echoed across the valley. She never complained. Complaints were remembered. Silence was forgotten. That morning had begun like every other until the captain of the palace guard descended the worn stone steps, carrying a long bundle wrapped in dark linen. Every washer stopped moving. Every conversation disappeared. No one needed an announcement. Everyone recognized the embroidered silver wolf stitched near the collar. It belonged to King Adrian Ashford, the Alpha King whose calm stare could silence an entire council chamber without a single spoken word. The captain placed the bundle onto Emily's table instead of anyone else's. "His Majesty wants this cleaned before sunset," he said. "No damage. No delays." Then he left without another glance. The room remained silent for several heartbeats before whispers floated between the rows of wooden tubs. Lucky. Unlucky. Dangerous. Emily ignored them. She untied the linen carefully, revealing a long black robe that still carried the crisp scent of cedar forests after rain, mixed with cool mountain air and the faint sweetness of winter pine. It looked almost untouched except for streaks of dried mud along the hem and tiny flecks of silver dust shimmering beneath the fabric as though moonlight itself had settled into every thread. She had cleaned noble robes before. She had cleaned ceremonial cloaks and embroidered capes worn during festivals. None had ever felt warm after being left alone for hours. Yet this one held a quiet heat against her palms, almost like someone had been wearing it moments earlier. Emily frowned and reached for the wash basin. The instant the robe unfolded completely, something impossible happened. A voice, soft enough to be mistaken for memory, yet clear enough to stop her breathing, drifted through the silence. "You always smell like lavender." Emily froze. The words had not come from the hallway. No servant stood nearby. Every washer remained busy several tables away. She slowly looked over her shoulder. Nothing. Only rising steam and rhythmic splashes echoed beneath the stone ceiling. Her pulse quickened. She shook her head once, convincing herself exhaustion could play strange tricks after weeks without a full day of rest. She lowered the robe into cool water. The fabric barely touched the surface before the whisper returned, warmer this time, almost amused. "Don't wash yourself away." Emily's fingers slipped. Water rippled across the basin while the enormous robe slid halfway beneath the surface. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the empty room again. No footsteps. No laughter. No hidden musician playing a prank. Only silence. But it was no longer the comforting silence she had known for years. It had become the kind that waits for someone to discover a secret buried far deeper than anyone ever intended. Emily did not tell anyone what she had heard because strange stories spread through Blackthorn Palace faster than smoke, and servants who became the center of gossip rarely remained in the palace for long. She emptied the basin, washed it twice, and convinced herself that fatigue had created an illusion. She had been awake before dawn every morning for nearly 3 years, carrying bundles across endless stone corridors, polishing ceremonial linens, and mending torn sleeves beneath flickering lanterns until her shoulders ached. Anyone could imagine a whisper after that much work. That had to be the answer. It was the only answer that made sense. She carefully laid the robe across the long cedar table and examined every inch of it beneath the afternoon light. The stitching was flawless. Silver thread traced the outline of a great wolf across the collar, each strand woven so perfectly it almost seemed alive. She brushed away dried dust with slow, practiced movements, avoiding every unnecessary touch. Yet something about the garment refused to feel ordinary. The fabric carried warmth even though the laundry room remained cool enough that steam drifted across the floor like early morning fog. It also carried a scent unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was not expensive perfume. It was not smoke or leather or polished steel like the clothing worn by the palace guards. It reminded her of towering pine trees after fresh rain, distant snow settling across quiet mountains, and the clean breeze that swept through valleys before sunrise. Without realizing it, she closed her eyes for only a second, breathing in that impossible fragrance. A peaceful feeling settled over her heart so suddenly that it frightened her more than the whispers had. Emily pulled back at once. She had spent years teaching herself never to become attached to anything inside the palace. Servants borrowed beauty for a moment and returned it before sunset. That was the rule. She folded the sleeves neatly and reached for the soft brush used only for royal garments. As the bristles glided across the fabric, another voice drifted into the silence. This time it sounded quieter, almost thoughtful. She works until her hands are cold. Emily stopped breathing. The brush slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the table. She stared at the empty doorway leading into the corridor. No shadow crossed the entrance. No footsteps echoed on the stone floor. Even the women working several yards away continued humming old harvest songs without looking toward her. If someone had spoken, why had nobody reacted? She slowly lifted the brush again, wondering whether touching the robe somehow awakened whatever impossible memory lived inside it. Her hands trembled despite every effort to steady them. She brushed another section. The whisper returned almost immediately. She smiles at everyone except herself. A chill traveled across her arms. Those words were impossible. No noble knew her well enough to notice something so small. Most members of the royal household barely remembered she existed. They passed through the laundry with eyes fixed ahead, seeing clean clothing, but never the people who restored it. Emily swallowed hard and carefully folded the robe again, determined to finish her work before sunset without listening any longer. Yet deep inside she already knew the truth she refused to admit. Whatever voice lived within the royal garment was not speaking to frighten her. It was speaking because somewhere beyond the palace walls, someone had carried feelings too deep to remain silent, and somehow those feelings had found their way into every thread she now held in her hands. The palace bell announced the final hour before sunset, just as Emily placed the freshly cleaned robe onto the wide oak table reserved for royal garments. The fabric looked flawless now. Every trace of dust had disappeared, every silver thread reflected the fading light, and the faint scent of lavender soap had blended gently with the cool fragrance that already belonged to it. She should have felt relieved. Instead, an uneasy curiosity settled deeper inside her chest. Throughout the afternoon, the whispers had never returned, almost as though they had decided they had already said too much. Emily told herself that silence was a blessing. She folded the robe with careful precision, aligning every edge exactly as she had been taught by the elderly head laundress during her first week inside Blackthorn Palace. Mrs. Margaret Dawson had repeated one lesson more often than any other. Never forget that royal clothing remembers its owner. At the time, Emily had laughed quietly, believing it was only another old superstition passed from one generation of servants to the next. Margaret had not laughed back. She had simply lowered her voice and explained that garments worn by powerful wolves carried traces no ordinary eye could see. Not magic meant to harm. Something older. Instinct. Loyalty. Memory. That was why no servant was allowed to keep a royal garment overnight unless specifically ordered. That was why nobody borrowed a royal cloak for warmth during winter storms. And that was why every piece had to be returned before moonrise. Emily had always obeyed those rules without asking questions. Today, for the first time, she wondered whether those forgotten warnings had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. As she reached for the linen wrapping, a faint breeze slipped through the narrow window high above the laundry room. The robe shifted almost imperceptibly across the table, although nothing else moved. Emily watched it carefully, waiting for another impossible voice. Several long seconds passed. Then, barely louder than the rustling fabric itself, the whisper returned. She always worries when she has done nothing wrong. Emily closed her eyes. She no longer believed exhaustion could explain what she was hearing. The words were too clear, too personal, too gentle. Whoever they described knew her in ways no stranger possibly could. She had never spoken about her habit of apologizing before anyone blamed her. She had never admitted that every mistake, no matter how small, kept her awake at night. Even Margaret only knew that Emily worked harder than anyone else. She did not know why. Emily slowly opened her eyes again. The room remained unchanged. Buckets rested against the stone wall. White sheets swayed gently from drying lines overhead. Several servants laughed together near the doorway while discussing tomorrow's harvest celebration in the village below the palace. Ordinary sounds filled the room, making the extraordinary feel even more impossible. She carefully wrapped the robe inside fresh linen, tied the cord, and lifted the bundle into her arms. It felt unexpectedly lighter than before, as though whatever invisible weight it had carried throughout the afternoon had begun to fade. She climbed the winding staircase leading toward the royal corridor where only trusted servants could enter. Every polished stone reflected the golden light of approaching evening. Portraits of past Alpha kings watched silently from the walls, each wearing the same composed expression that had become the symbol of royal authority. Emily kept her gaze lowered as always. She wanted only to deliver the robe and return unnoticed. Yet before she reached the final hallway, the bundle grew warm against her hands once more. One final whisper drifted upward, carrying a quiet certainty that sent her heart racing. One day she will finally look at me instead of the floor. Emily stopped in the middle of the corridor. Her breath caught. Those words could not have belonged to a memory. They sounded like a hope waiting for tomorrow. Emily forced herself to keep walking even though every instinct urged her to unwrap the bundle again. The corridor outside the royal chambers stretched nearly 100 feet beneath towering arched windows, where the last rays of evening painted the marble floor with bands of gold and amber. Palace attendants passed quietly, each carrying polished trays, fresh flowers, or stacks of neatly folded linens. No one paid attention to the young Omega holding the carefully wrapped robe against her chest. That was the strange comfort of palace life. Servants became part of the walls, noticed only when something went wrong. Emily reached the carved walnut door leading to the royal wardrobe, where every garment worn by the Alpha King was catalogued and stored with meticulous care. Before she could knock, the elderly keeper of the wardrobe, Mr. Nathan Holloway, opened the door as though he had already been expecting her. His silver hair framed a thoughtful face that had watched 3 generations of royal wolves grow into adulthood. His sharp blue eyes settled on the bundle before meeting Emily's uncertain expression. "Right on time," he said with a faint smile. "His Majesty appreciates punctual people, even if he rarely says so." Emily lowered her gaze respectfully and extended the robe. Nathan accepted it with practiced hands, but paused for the briefest moment. His expression shifted ever so slightly, almost as though he had sensed something unusual lingering within the fabric. He did not unwrap it. Instead, he rested one weathered hand lightly across the folded linen, closed his eyes for a single heartbeat, then opened them again without explanation. "Did anything seem unusual while cleaning it?" he asked quietly. Emily's pulse skipped. The whispers echoed inside her memory with perfect clarity, but she could not imagine speaking those impossible words aloud. Who would believe that a robe had spoken with kindness? She shook her head after a careful pause. "No, sir. Everything was cleaned according to the palace standards." Nathan studied her face for another moment. Whatever answer he had expected, he did not press further. "Very good," he replied softly. "You may go home for the evening." Emily thanked him and turned toward the staircase, relieved the conversation had ended. Yet before she reached the first step, another servant hurried down the hallway carrying a sealed message decorated with the royal crest. "Mr. Holloway," the young messenger called, slightly out of breath. His Majesty returned earlier than expected. He requested the traveling cloak instead of the ceremonial robe for tonight's council meeting. Nathan looked from the messenger to the freshly cleaned garment still resting across his arms. "Then this will need to wait until tomorrow morning," he murmured. "Place it in the private wardrobe." Emily froze halfway down the staircase. Tomorrow morning. The robe would remain inside the royal chambers overnight instead of returning to the king's shoulders. She did not understand why that tiny change unsettled her so deeply. She quietly continued toward the servants' quarters as darkness settled over Blackthorn Palace and lanterns flickered to life one by one. The palace grew quieter after sunset, but her thoughts refused to do the same. Every whisper replayed with unsettling clarity, each one filled with quiet admiration that the Alpha King himself had never shown. Somewhere above her, behind heavy oak doors and silent stone walls, rested the robe that had somehow known her hidden fears, her quiet habits, and the dreams she had never spoken aloud. Emily reached her small room beneath the western tower, lit a single candle, and tried to convince herself that tomorrow everything would return to normal. Yet as she closed her eyes, one final sentence drifted through her memory with a tenderness that refused to fade. She does not know she has already become the safest place my heart has ever found. Emily slept lightly, as she always did, but sometime after midnight she awoke without knowing why. The tiny room beneath the western tower remained still except for the quiet crackling of a single candle that had nearly burned itself out. Moonlight slipped through the narrow window and rested across the wooden floor in a pale silver rectangle. She lay perfectly still, listening. The palace often settled with gentle sounds after dark. Old beams creaked. Wind brushed against the stone walls. Somewhere far above, the midnight watch changed shifts. Everything sounded familiar until a faint warmth spread through the room, carrying the same clean scent of pine forests after fresh snow that she had breathed in only hours before. Emily slowly sat up, her heartbeat quickening. The fragrance should not have been there. The royal robe remained locked inside the private wardrobe across the palace. Yet the scent lingered as though an invisible breeze had traveled impossible distances to find her. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped toward the window. The castle grounds below rested beneath a blanket of moonlight. Garden paths curved between ancient oak trees, while the marble fountain reflected the stars like scattered pieces of glass. Nothing moved. No lanterns drifted through the courtyard. No guards crossed the bridges below. Everything appeared peaceful. Then the whisper returned. It did not come from outside. It did not echo through the hallway. It seemed to bloom gently inside the silence surrounding her, carrying the same calm voice she had heard throughout the afternoon. I wish she knew she never has to earn kindness. Emily closed her eyes. Instead of fear, an unexpected sadness settled quietly over her heart. Whoever these impossible words belonged to sounded lonely. They carried no command, no pride, no royal authority. Only quiet affection wrapped inside longing. She pressed one hand against the cool stone beside the window, hoping the sensation would ground her in reality. Another whisper followed before she could steady her. Breathing. She thanks everyone for every little thing because nobody ever stayed long enough to thank her. Emily felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes. She had never spoken those thoughts aloud. Since childhood, she had learned that appreciation disappeared quickly, so she had offered it freely before it could vanish. It had become part of who she was, as natural as breathing. Yet somehow these unseen words understood her better than anyone living inside the palace. She whispered into the empty room, almost embarrassed by the sound of her own voice. Who are you? Silence answered first, long enough that she believed the strange connection had finally ended. Then the gentlest reply drifted through the moonlit air. I am the part that cannot lie. Emily frowned softly, repeating those words inside her mind. The part that cannot lie. They made no sense, yet they felt strangely important, like the final piece of a puzzle she had not realized she was solving. The warmth faded slowly, leaving only cool night air flowing through the window. Dawn remained several hours away, but Emily knew sleep would not return. She sat beside the window until the eastern sky softened from black to deep blue, watching the first birds circle above the palace towers. Somewhere beyond those walls, the Alpha King was preparing for another day of councils, petitions, and royal duties, completely unaware that something connected to him had crossed every distance to reach a servant whose name he probably did not even know. Emily lowered her gaze toward her folded hands, unaware that at almost that exact moment, in the highest chamber of Blackthorn Palace, King Adrian Ashford paused in the middle of fastening his traveling cloak, overcome by the unshakable feeling that someone, somewhere within his own home, had been quietly occupying his thoughts long before he understood why. The morning unfolded with the familiar rhythm of palace life, yet nothing inside Emily felt familiar anymore. Every basket she lifted seemed lighter than the thoughts she carried. She arrived at the royal laundry before sunrise, tied her apron neatly, and immersed her hands in cool water, hoping ordinary work would quiet the impossible memories of the previous night. Steam slowly filled the room as rows of copper kettles warmed, filling the air with the comforting scent of clean linen and lavender soap. Other servants chatted about the coming harvest celebration, laughing over simple plans for their evening in the nearby village. Emily tried to join their smiles, but every few moments she caught herself listening for a voice that no one else could hear. She almost convinced herself it had all been a dream until Mr. Nathan Holloway appeared in the doorway carrying another neatly wrapped bundle. The conversation stopped at once. Once again, the embroidered silver wolf could be seen beneath the folded linen. Nathan crossed the room and placed the bundle gently onto Emily's table. "His Majesty requires this one prepared before noon," he said. "He leaves for an inspection this afternoon." Emily blinked in surprise. "Another robe?" Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "He has accumulated more travel than rest lately." His eyes lingered on her for a brief moment, almost as though he wished to ask another question, but instead he simply wished her a productive morning and quietly departed. Emily stared at the folded garment. It was not the same robe from yesterday. This one carried darker embroidery along the cuffs and a heavier winter lining. Even so, the instant her fingertips touched the fabric, table linens, nobody glanced toward her. Nobody reacted. Whatever connection existed remained hers alone. She gently lifted one sleeve and began brushing away a thin layer of road dust collected from recent travel. The whisper continued, calm and unhurried, almost like someone speaking truths they had hidden for far too long. She apologizes before she is blamed. She smiles before she is welcomed. She leaves before anyone can ask her to stay. Emily stopped brushing. Those words settled deeply inside her because they were true in ways she had never fully realized herself. She had spent years making herself smaller so that other people would feel comfortable. She had believed disappearing was safer than being noticed. Yet the unseen voice seemed to grieve every quiet sacrifice she had accepted without question. Another whisper followed, carrying gentle certainty instead of sorrow. "One day I will convince her that she belongs wherever she stands." Emily's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Whoever spoke these impossible confessions did not sound like a proud ruler or an untouchable king. The voice sounded honest, patient, and incapable of hiding what it felt. For the first time, a fragile realization formed inside her heart. These were not random echoes trapped inside royal clothing. They were pieces of someone who loved without knowing how to remain silent. And somehow, against every law of reason, those hidden feelings had found their way into her waiting hands. Emily finished cleaning the second robe with slower hands than usual, not because the work demanded greater care, but because every passing minute felt strangely precious. She found herself waiting for each quiet confession as though the invisible voice had become a companion hidden beneath the fabric. When the final sleeve had been brushed smooth and every silver thread reflected the morning light, the whispers stopped again. The silence felt heavier than before. She folded the robe carefully, yet instead of wrapping it immediately, she reached into the small pocket sewn inside her apron and removed a worn notebook no larger than the palm of her hand. It had once belonged to her father, who had used it to record grocery lists and simple household expenses before he passed away. Most of its pages remained blank. Emily hesitated only a moment before opening it to the first empty page. In neat handwriting, she copied every sentence she could still remember. "You always smell like lavender. Do not wash yourself away. She works until her hands are cold. She smiles at everyone except herself. She always worries when she has done nothing wrong. One day she will finally look at me instead of the floor." She stared at the growing list, hardly believing that she was writing words spoken by something no one else seemed capable of hearing. She almost tore the page out. Keeping such notes felt foolish. If another servant discovered them, the whispers would sound like the imagination of an exhausted Omega. Yet something deep inside her refused to let the words disappear. They deserved to be remembered. They had been spoken with too much sincerity to fade into silence. She closed the notebook and tucked it safely back inside her apron just as another servant approached her table carrying a stack of neatly pressed towels. Clara Benson was only a year older than Emily and one of the few people in the laundry who treated everyone with equal kindness. Clara smiled warmly. "You have been awfully quiet these last 2 days," she observed. "Are you feeling all right?" Emily returned a small smile. "I am only tired." Clara tilted her head thoughtfully. "You keep looking at the royal robes as though you expect them to answer you." Emily felt her heartbeat stumble. "Do I?" Clara laughed softly. "Maybe I have spent too many years down here myself. Sometimes I think these old walls remember more conversations than people do." With that harmless remark, she continued across the room, leaving Emily frozen beside the cedar table. The words lingered long after Clara disappeared. "Remember more conversations than people do." Emily glanced toward the folded robe. Could memories truly cling to fabric touched by powerful wolves? Was she hearing echoes from the past instead of living thoughts? Before she could decide, footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. The palace guards entered carrying travel gear, preparing for the Alpha King's afternoon departure. Emily instinctively lowered her eyes as they passed, just as she always had. Through the open doorway, she caught only the briefest glimpse of King Adrian Ashford crossing the distant corridor. Tall, composed, and surrounded by advisors, he moved with quiet confidence, acknowledging reports with calm nods while never raising his voice. He did not look toward the laundry. He did not know she existed. Yet at the exact instant he passed beyond sight, the folded robe resting only inches from Emily's hands released one final whisper so soft that it almost disappeared beneath the sounds of the busy palace. "There she is." Emily slowly looked up toward the now empty corridor, unable to explain why those 3 simple words filled her heart with hope instead of fear. The afternoon should have ended like every other afternoon, with clean garments returned to their proper places and servants quietly disappearing before the evening bell. Instead, one small mistake unraveled the fragile sense of peace Emily had managed to hold together. She had just finished wrapping the freshly cleaned robe when Mr. Nathan Holloway called her into the storage room to help organize several winter cloaks recently brought back from the Northern Territories. She placed her apron neatly on the corner of her work table, forgetting for the first time that the small notebook remained tucked inside its pocket. The task lasted no more than 15 minutes. Shelves were rearranged, inventory lists were checked, and dust covers were replaced over ceremonial garments that would not be worn until the first snowfall. Emily thanked Nathan quietly and returned to the laundry room, expecting another ordinary hour of work. The moment she stepped through the doorway, she knew something was wrong. 2 servants stood near her table whispering with unusual excitement. Another quickly looked away the instant Emily appeared. Clara Benson noticed her first and immediately walked over with concern written across her face. "Emily," she said gently, "were you looking for your notebook?" Emily's heart tightened. Her hands flew instinctively to the empty pocket of her apron. "Where is it?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Oliver found it while moving your apron. He thought it was a list of palace inventory." Emily looked across the room. Oliver Hayes, one of the younger laundry assistants, stood beside the open notebook with several curious servants gathered around him. He was smiling the uncertain smile of someone who believed he had uncovered an amusing secret. Emily hurried forward, trying to keep her voice calm. "Please give it back." Oliver glanced at the page once more before looking at her with open confusion. "These are not inventory notes," he said. "These sound like love letters." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. Emily felt warmth rush into her face. She reached for the notebook, but Oliver instinctively stepped backward. "Listen to this," he read aloud before she could stop him. "She smiles at everyone except herself." "Who wrote that?" "And this one. One day she will finally look at me instead of the floor." "Emily, who have you been secretly meeting?" More laughter followed, though none of it sounded cruel. It sounded curious. That somehow made it worse. Emily finally took the notebook from his hands and held it tightly against her chest. "They are not mine," she whispered. The room grew quieter. Oliver frowned. "Then whose are they?" Emily opened her mouth, but no answer came. She could hardly tell them that the words came from robes worn by the Alpha King. No one would believe her. Even she barely believed herself. Clara stepped between them with quiet firmness. "Enough," she said. "If Emily says they are private, then they are private." The other servants slowly returned to their work, yet whispers lingered beneath the ordinary sounds of running water and folded linen. Emily could feel curious glances following her throughout the remainder of the afternoon. She kept her eyes lowered, finishing every task without another word. Before leaving for the evening, She slipped the notebook into a small wooden box beneath her bed, convinced it would be safer hidden away. As she closed the lid, a quiet realization settled over her. The notebook no longer contained impossible whispers alone. It had become evidence of a mystery that was growing larger than she could control, and somewhere else within Blackthorn Palace, completely unaware of the quiet storm forming around a forgotten servant, King Adrian Ashford paused in the middle of an evening meeting, distracted by an unfamiliar feeling that someone precious to his heart had just been hurt. Emily arrived before dawn the next morning, hoping that hard work would erase the awkwardness left behind by the notebook. Instead, she found the laundry room quieter than usual. Conversations faded whenever she entered, replaced by polite smiles that disappeared as soon as she looked away. Nobody confronted her directly, yet she could feel the weight of unanswered questions hanging in the warm air between rows of steaming wash basins. Clara greeted her with the same kindness as always, but even she seemed uncertain whether to ask about the mysterious sentences written across those worn pages. Emily appreciated the silence. She had no explanation she could safely give. Mid-morning sunlight filtered through the narrow windows when Mr. Nathan Holloway appeared carrying another sealed bundle wrapped in royal linen. His expression remained calm, although there was a seriousness in his eyes Emily had never noticed before. "This requires your attention," he said quietly. His Majesty requested it personally. Emily accepted the bundle with careful hands. "Personally," she repeated before realizing she had spoken aloud. Nathan simply nodded. The traveling schedule changed again. "He wants this prepared immediately." He lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Emily, if anything unusual happens while you are working, come to me first." She searched his face for some hint that he already knew about the whispers, but his expression revealed nothing more. After he left, Emily slowly untied the linen cord. Inside rested another dark robe, lighter than the previous two, with silver embroidery flowing across the shoulders like moonlight reflected on quiet water. The familiar scent of cedar and winter pine surrounded her almost instantly. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, bracing herself. The whisper arrived, before her fingers even reached the fabric. She came back even after yesterday. Emily swallowed softly. "I had work to do," she whispered under her breath. The answer came with gentle warmth. "She always chooses duty before herself." A quiet ache settled inside her chest. She unfolded the robe across the cedar table and reached for the soft brush, determined to finish quickly before anyone noticed her speaking again. Every careful stroke across the fabric released another quiet confession. She believes kindness should never expect reward. Brush. She carries lonely days as though they weigh nothing. Brush. She does not know someone has been watching her smile from across the courtyard for months. Emily's hand stopped moving. Her heart raced so suddenly she could hear it above the splashing water nearby. Watching her, she searched her memory. She crossed the eastern courtyard every morning carrying fresh linens toward the palace chapel. Hundreds of people passed through that path. Guards, gardeners, stable workers, advisors. She had never once looked long enough to notice whether anyone looked back. Before she could gather another thought, hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Oliver entered carrying an inventory ledger, followed by two palace attendants delivering fresh uniforms. His eyes drifted toward Emily, then toward the royal robes spread across her table. She instinctively stepped between the garment and the room, shielding it without realizing what she was doing. Oliver paused. The curious smile from yesterday slowly returned. Emily recognized the expression at once. He remembered the notebook. He remembered every mysterious sentence inside it. Although he said nothing, she understood that quiet speculation had not disappeared overnight. It had only grown. And as she lowered her gaze toward the robe once more, one final whisper floated gently through the silence, carrying not fear, but quiet certainty. "Soon, everyone will hear what only she can hear now." Emily wrapped the robe in fresh linen with hands that no longer felt steady. The final whisper lingered in her thoughts long after the room had fallen silent again. "Soon, everyone will hear what only she can hear now." She wanted to dismiss those words as another mystery she would never understand, yet they settled inside her heart with the quiet certainty of approaching rain. Before she could carry the garment upstairs, Mr. Nathan Holloway entered once more, accompanied by a palace attendant dressed in the dark silver uniform reserved for the royal council. The attendant bowed politely. His Majesty has returned earlier than expected. The wardrobe is being prepared for tonight's gathering. The robe should be delivered directly to the great council hall. Emily blinked in surprise. Royal garments were almost always taken to the private wardrobe first. Nathan studied her expression before giving a calm nod. Take it yourself. I will accompany you. Together they climbed the wide staircase leading toward the highest level of Blackthorn Palace. The sounds of the busy laundry faded behind them, replaced by the quiet dignity of polished marble corridors lined with tall windows overlooking the valley below. As they approached the council chamber, Emily noticed servants arranging fresh flowers while advisors carried scrolls and leather-bound ledgers inside. Everything moved with careful purpose. Nathan stopped beside the carved oak doors. "Wait here," he said gently. "I will announce the delivery." Emily stood alone in the hallway holding the wrapped robe against her arms. She lowered her eyes as footsteps echoed beyond the doors. Voices drifted through the chamber, calm and measured. Then the doors opened. Nathan stepped aside. "Bring it in." Emily crossed the threshold without lifting her gaze. The great council hall stretched nearly 80 feet beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations and silver wolves running beneath the moon. Long tables curved around the room where advisors, commanders, and royal scholars quietly discussed maps spread before them. At the far end stood King Adrian Ashford beside a tall window overlooking the forests beyond the palace walls. He wore a simple dark traveling coat instead of ceremonial robes, yet his presence naturally drew every eye. Emily walked forward until she reached the polished cedar stand prepared for the garment. She carefully placed the wrapped robe upon it and stepped back with a respectful bow. For one quiet moment, nothing happened. Then Adrian reached forward and rested one hand upon the folded linen. The instant his fingertips touched the fabric, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Emily felt the same gentle warmth she had come to recognize spreading through the robe, but this time it did not remain hidden. A calm voice, unmistakably the same one she had heard for days, floated into the stillness with perfect clarity. "She is here." Emily's eyes widened. Around the chamber, several advisors looked up in startled confusion. Nathan froze beside the doorway. Even the royal scribes stopped writing. Adrian slowly looked around the room, his composed expression giving way to quiet disbelief. Before anyone could speak, another confession emerged from the robe, gentle and sincere. "Please stop looking at the floor. I have wanted to see your eyes since the first morning you carried fresh linens through the eastern courtyard." Complete silence settled over the hall. Emily forgot to breathe. The impossible words were no longer hers alone. Every person inside the chamber had heard them. Adrian remained perfectly still, his hand resting on the robe as though afraid to move. For the first time since Emily had entered Blackthorn Palace, the Alpha King looked not powerful or untouchable, but completely astonished, as if a part of himself he had never allowed to speak had finally found its own voice before the entire kingdom. No one in the great council hall moved. The silence that followed those impossible words felt deeper than any command ever spoken within those ancient walls. Emily remained where she stood, her eyes fixed on the polished floor out of habit, although every heartbeat urged her to look up. She feared that if she met the Alpha King's gaze, she would discover she had imagined everything. Across the chamber, Adrian Ashford slowly withdrew his hand from the folded robe, only for another quiet confession to drift into the stillness before anyone could speak. "She always leaves before I find the courage to walk toward her." Several council members exchanged bewildered glances. One elderly advisor removed his spectacles as though clearer vision might explain what his ears had just heard. Nathan Holloway lowered his head thoughtfully, and for the first time in many years, a gentle smile touched the corners of his face. He seemed less surprised than quietly relieved. Adrian remained perfectly still. His silver eyes rested on the robe, then slowly lifted toward the young servant standing several feet away. Emily sensed the weight of his attention before she finally gathered enough courage to raise her head. Their eyes met for the first time. There was no anger waiting for her, no accusation, only honest confusion mixed with something softer, something that looked remarkably similar to recognition. Memories surfaced inside Adrian's mind with startling clarity. a young Omega carrying fresh linen across the eastern courtyard every morning. A quiet smile offered to elderly gardeners before sunrise. Gentle hands helping an injured bird back onto a garden wall instead of hurrying past. A servant who always thanked everyone, even those who rarely acknowledged her presence. He had noticed those moments without understanding why they remained with him long after each day ended. He had dismissed them as passing observations, believing a king had little time to wonder why one familiar face quietly brightened otherwise ordinary mornings. Now those forgotten memories connected like stars forming a single constellation. Before he could gather his thoughts, the Robe spoke once more, its gentle voice carrying the sincerity of a heart that had hidden nothing. You kept pretending she was only another servant because you believed a king should master every feeling. I never agreed. A quiet breath escaped Adrian before he realized he had made a sound. The words did not embarrass him. They revealed something he had spent months refusing to examine. His wolf had recognized what his disciplined mind continued to overlook. While he buried himself beneath duty, ceremonies, and endless decisions, the deepest part of himself had simply watched Emily with patient affection, remembering every quiet kindness she believed no one had ever seen. Emily felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. She finally understood why every whisper had carried such warmth. They had never been meant to frighten her. They had been the honest thoughts of a heart that refused to hide behind titles or expectations. Adrian took one slow step forward. The entire council instinctively remained silent. He stopped several feet away, careful not to invade her space, his calm expression gentler than anyone in the room had ever witnessed. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, speaking her name for the very first time, "I believe my wolf has been introducing itself long before I ever thought to do so." Emily looked at him with astonishment, and for the first time since entering Blackthorn Palace years earlier, she did not lower her eyes to the floor. Emily stood motionless, scarcely believing that the Alpha King had spoken her name with such quiet sincerity. The council chamber remained wrapped in astonished silence, yet the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt as though everyone present had become witness to a truth that had waited patiently beneath countless ordinary mornings. Adrian held her gaze for another gentle moment before turning toward the assembled advisors. His calm expression returned, but it carried a warmth none of them had ever seen before. "Miss Emily Carter has committed no offense," he said clearly. "She carried out every duty entrusted to her with honesty and care. If questions remain about what was heard today, those questions belong to me, not to her." Several council members lowered their heads respectfully. None argued. Nathan Holloway quietly smiled, his eyes reflecting years of understanding that finally made sense. Emily felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over her. She had spent so much of her life preparing to apologize that she hardly knew what it felt like to be defended before anyone demanded an explanation. Adrian stepped closer to the cedar stand where the robe still rested. He placed one hand lightly across the folded fabric once again, not to command it, but almost as though greeting an old companion he had misunderstood for far too long. Another whisper drifted softly into the chamber. "Thank you for finally listening." This time Adrian smiled. It was small, almost shy, but genuine enough to leave every advisor quietly stunned. "It appears," he said with gentle amusement, "that my wolf has stronger opinions than I ever admitted." A ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room, easing the tension without breaking the quiet dignity of the moment. Emily found herself smiling too. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Palace, she smiled without worrying who might notice. Adrian looked back toward her. "You once believed no one saw the kindness you offered every day," he said. "I was mistaken in believing that simply noticing was enough. Kindness deserves to be acknowledged." Emily felt tears gather again, though this time they came from gratitude rather than uncertainty. She had never expected recognition. She had only hoped to do her work well enough to remain unnoticed. Yet somehow, through impossible whispers carried inside ordinary cloth, she had been seen more clearly than she had ever imagined. Adrian turned once more to the council. "From this day forward," he announced, "no servant of this palace will be mocked for quiet devotion or humble work. Every role within these walls strengthens this kingdom." His words were not loud, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of royal promise. Every advisor bowed in agreement. Clara Benson, standing quietly near the entrance among the household attendants, smiled proudly when Emily finally noticed her. Nathan offered Emily a reassuring nod that seemed to say he had believed the truth would reveal itself in its own time. As the meeting slowly resumed, Adrian remained beside the robe for one final heartbeat. A last whisper rose like a gentle breeze through the stillness. She finally looked at us. Emily met his eyes again, and this time neither of them looked away. In that quiet exchange, titles, duties, and expectations seemed to fade, leaving only two people who had unexpectedly found each other through honesty that neither fear nor silence had been able to hide. The days that followed settled over Blackthorn Palace with a quiet kind of wonder. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. The laundry still filled with steam before sunrise. The palace bells still echoed across the valley every morning. Emily still folded linens with the same careful hands that had always taken pride in unnoticed work. Yet every familiar routine now carried a gentle difference. People greeted her by name instead of simply passing by. The servants who had once whispered uncertainly now smiled with genuine respect, not because of rumors or impossible voices, but because they had witnessed the Alpha King himself speak with gratitude about the quiet strength hidden behind ordinary duties. Clara often found Emily smiling to herself while arranging fresh robes, and for the first time, Emily did not immediately hide that smile. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Nathan Holloway entered the laundry carrying a long cedar box instead of the usual folded bundle. He placed it carefully upon Emily's work table without saying a word. The polished lid bore the royal crest carved into its surface, yet no official seal closed it. Emily looked at Nathan with quiet confusion. He simply nodded toward the box. His Majesty requested that only you prepare what is inside. Emily slowly lifted the lid. Resting within soft linen lay another black robe, newly tailored, untouched by travel or ceremony. The silver embroidery shimmered beneath the morning light with remarkable craftsmanship, every thread reflecting quiet elegance rather than royal grandeur. There was no dust to brush away, no crease to smooth. It looked as though it had been made only moments earlier. She reached toward the fabric almost cautiously, wondering whether another gentle confession waited within its folds. The familiar warmth greeted her fingertips immediately, but this time the robe remained silent. Emily smiled softly. Perhaps there were no more hidden words left to discover. She carefully unfolded the garment across the cedar table, preparing to inspect the stitching. As she adjusted the collar, something unexpected caught her attention. Tucked neatly beneath the folded edge rested a small cream-colored envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. Emily hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a single sheet of thick paper. Unlike every whisper that had reached her through unseen magic, these words had been written deliberately by a steady human hand. She recognized the careful script immediately from royal decrees displayed throughout the palace. It belonged to Adrian Ashford himself. The message was simple. My wolf found the courage before I did. I believe it is finally my turn to be just as honest. Thank you for seeing kindness as something worth giving, even when you believed no one noticed. Please do not spend another day believing your quiet heart walks alone. Emily read the letter twice before gently folding it again. Her eyes filled with grateful tears, but she smiled through them. There were no mysterious voices this time because none were needed anymore. Truth no longer had to hide inside cloth, memories, or whispered confessions. It had found its rightful place inside spoken words and written promises. Emily carefully pressed the robe one final time before placing it back inside the cedar box. As she closed the lid, a soft breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of pine, cedar, and fresh autumn air across the quiet laundry room. She looked toward the palace gardens where golden leaves danced beneath the morning sun. In the distance, Adrian stood alone beneath an ancient oak, his gaze lifting toward the eastern windows at the exact moment Emily looked outside. Neither of them waved. Neither needed to. Across the peaceful distance, they simply smiled, knowing that sometimes the truest love story begins not with grand declarations, but with the quiet courage to finally let an honest heart be heard.